pressure looks good.
Doubling up. Roger, roll, planet. Flight downside, speed off.
Yikes. You bet. Okay. We don't need any more of these.
All right, folks, y'all know the drill. It's time for another NASA Spaceflight Live today. Let me know if you can hear me, and let me know if you can see me and my two esteemed guests today. A host, I guess, on this side, and a guest on this side. Let me know in chat 5x5. You're part of our remote production crew. We don't have a cast of thousands behind this thing. Don't ask Jonathan, because I've been talking to him about how we run the shows for the last 30 minutes in the background, but let me know that you can hear and see us. I'm getting a lot of 5x5s in chat. That's what we like to. I got chat over here today. I have chat up here too. I actually have a lot of chat around me, but it is time for another NASA Spaceflight Live. This is our weekly live stream where we talk about space news. It's almost like a podcast sort of format where we just bring up some cool topics, we get some cool guests on, and we just talk about what's going on. So without further ado, let's go ahead and introduce our special guest today. Over on this side, yep, my skills of a weather presenter are doing well. We've got Jonathan McDowell. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Good afternoon.
All right, so you are sort of the, what's the right way to put it, the resident expert on what's in space and when it got put there? Is that a good way to say it?
Yeah, I like to think of myself as the chronicler of the space age.
There you go, the chronicler of the space age. So we're going to talk a lot about what Jonathan works on, the different projects he works on professionally, and I can't even call it a hobby, honestly. You put so much work into it. I don't think that hobby does it justice. But let's go over here and make sure we can get Chris Gebhardt on as well. Chris, how you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing just fine. Excited to be here.
All right, chat, can we hear both Jonathan and Chris as well? Let me know that they're both 5x5s. Put their name and then put their signal quality next to them so that I know that you can hear both of them. And we will get started with today's exciting episode of NASA Spaceflight Live. We always do these shows live. It's right there on the title. It's live. So over the course of the show, if you have questions for us, feel free to ask your questions. It's live and interactive as much as we can make it, because we've got an hour and a half to talk here. And we're never going to be able to talk about everything that we want to talk about. So tag us in chat at NASA Spaceflight. That'll put it into the cool software on the back end here. When we get a chance and when the questions are relevant to the topic at hand, I'll pull some of those questions out and I will give them to Chris and Jonathan. But without further ado, nobody comes here to see my face and me talk. Let's hop into what we're doing today. Chris, let's start off with a little introduction on the background with what Jonathan does. Let's have a discussion about that.
Yeah, definitely. Jonathan, I think a lot of us know you for the very detailed orbital analyses that you do, because that's a lot of what we interact with you on Twitter. But your research, specifically with the Chandra X-ray telescope and in the field of astrophysics, is also something I really wanted to touch on. So, my first question, to sort of get us started, is what got you fascinated in space? And what sort of steered you toward the realm of astrophysics?
Right. Yeah, that's a good one. And it really comes from two different directions. Part of it is that my dad was a physicist. He was on sabbatical at NASA Goddard in 1968, the year before the moon landing. So I was an 8-year-old running up and down the corridors of NASA. So it was all downhill from there. So growing up, then the real thing was that we came back to England, right? And in England, the media did not care about space, and there was no NASASpaceflight.com in 1969. And
there weren't very many .coms in 1969.
yeah, right. And so I had to learn to kind of research myself on what was going on, because the media weren't doing it for me. And that led me down this path of getting all this data about space. So that was sort of the space side, and then the astronomy side was actually more philosophical. In that I was, where did we come from? What is the universe that we live in? And I became an atheist at age 12, and I read a Fred Hoyle book on cosmology and went, oh right, this story makes much more sense. And so that led me down the path of being really interested in the big picture cosmology, the universe, the and so on and so forth. And so that's partly what led me down the astrophysics path, as well as the fact that math is one of the few things that I'm competent to do, and so it seems like a good fit.
Well, well, I think one thing no one can confidently say about me is that math is something I'm competent to do. I guess I say that, but like I hit a math wall, or so I thought, with calculus, and AP calculus in high school, and it really bummed me out because I had wanted to study astronomy in college, and when I realized that I wasn't understanding the math and that it only got harder from there, I was like, well, guess I better go find something else, and then took an intro to astronomy course my final semester, understood it all in context, and have so kind of regretted that decision ever since.
It's it's really unfortunate that people get turned off by math or maths as we call it in England in school, and uh, I think there's this sort of mental freeze of fear, uh,
Mhm.
and it's I see it as like it is hard in the same way that working out is hard, right? And I suck at that, but it's like you work up a mental sweat, right? But if you push at it and if you have the right teachers, I think most people have a lot more potential to be competent at math than they think they do.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And it's just finding the right way of reaching it.
Yeah.
The other thing
Yeah.
is, I mean, I actually didn't realize that there were any other career options because all of my babysitters were physics graduate students. And so I just thought a PhD was something that you had to get, and.
See,
Well,
I
I think it's like for me, like it took me forever because I grew up just north of the Space Center here in Florida, so it took me forever to figure out that people can't just walk outside and watch these things launch, and that it's not a part of everyone's life. I mean, it's no surprise I do what I do now. I mean, it's been a part of my life since before I can remember. Yeah.
I was never very good at the advanced math, so I just played Kerbal Space Program.
And-
Yeah, that's something I've never actually played with, but
Really?
for
Oh,
me,
wow.
for me, a lot of the fun is writing my own code.
There you go. Gotta get you
Uh,
hooked up with KOS or RPC or something like that. All right. So we have a lot of topics to talk about, but I missed something earlier, y'all. There's a pinned message at the top of the chat, and I was supposed to say this earlier and I forgot. When we do the when we do live streams, a lot of times we'll have super chats that come in. That's one reason we can keep these live streams going, helping us pay the bills, keep the lights on. But when we have a special guest, we dedicate is the word I was looking for, all of our time to the special guest. So even though I see some super chats are coming in, I appreciate the support. We will be looking for questions and things like that, but we're not going to be reading through the super chats live like we do a lot of the times because we want all the time to be dedicated to talking with Jonathan here. So I appreciate the support. Just be advised that we really do appreciate it. That's why we can do it, but we're not going to be reading through those. If anybody has a question, for free, just tag us in chat at NASASpaceflight to ask questions that are relevant to the topics we're talking about. I apologize, guys. I missed that earlier, and I was supposed to do that little disclaimer on the super chat situation, and then I saw the queue filling up over here. So appreciate y'all. Um, we have a lot of topics to talk about, right? We've got everybody's favorite or not favorite orbital internet constellations. We've got the amount of stuff we're putting up into space. We're going to be talking
Yes.
about X-ray telescopes with Chandra and stuff like that. And then where does space begin? I think we've
Everyone's favorite. I mean, I know that's why you're all here. You all want to hear us have our conversation about the Karman line, and we know that, so we're saving that for the end.
what
Uh,
is
it's so
space?
annoying, right, that they always save the question people want to the end. It's like, as a viewer, I hate that.
So I think
and-
Chris, go ahead.
oh yeah, no, Das, what were you saying? Yeah,
I was
yeah.
saying I think we were slated to start off with Starlink, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to start with Starlink because there were two launches this week that are sort of germane to the conversation of orbital debris and stuff like that, or all the stuff that we're putting up there, and one that's also germane to orbital debris. We had the successful launch of 60 new Starlink satellites on Wednesday of last week, and we also have the next round of launches coming up here on Tuesday. There, you know, we also had in DOS, this is the first one, this is
Yep.
the first link in our document. We also had this fantastic photograph that was taken from the ground showing a single Starlink. And this sort of started to get me thinking, Jonathan, right? Especially having you on this week. The relationship between Starlink and these other mega constellations like OneWeb and Kuiper coming up, and their relationship to astronomy. We heard a lot about it when the constellations first launched, and SpaceX has said that they were working on mitigation strategies. And I guess my overall question to sort of start us off is, what's that sort of current picture in the relationship that we have between the Starlink constellation and astronomy?
Right. So, we've in the astronomy community, we were caught a little flat-footed when Starlink first went up, but we've been working hard on understanding the implications. And we've had a couple of conferences now, and I'm on the organizing committee for a conference in July that's going to exactly revisit where are we now and what do we feel. So SatCon 2 in July. But and so we're still trying to understand exactly how bad it's going to be. And the problem is that the Starlink satellites, right? They're low, they're big, and they're bright, and they're because they're low and big, and so that's gonna be an issue when one passes in front of your telescope. Now, to SpaceX's credit, they have been, having real conversations with the astronomy community and making improvements. So far, they've added the visors to the satellites, and they've also changed the attitude control law so that they point a little differently. And those mitigations have made the satellites significantly fainter, but not yet quite faint enough that we as astronomers can relax. I think what they have done is, I was worried that, I'm not worried about, the 1,000 or so, 1,400 Starlinks that are up there right now.
Right.
I'm
Right.
worried by the 4,000 or 5,000 that they're planning to destroy, and I'm really worried by the 30,000 that their Generation 2 filing is asking for. And when you combine that with the 48,000 that OneWeb originally asked for, now reduced, but the comparable numbers from the Chinese GW constellation,
Right.
and then another few thousand here and there from Amazon and from other operators that all add up. So you're looking, on a 5-year time scale, or maybe a 10-year time scale, more realistically, at the 100,000 kind of number for
Wow.
large satellites in LEO.
Right.
That is just a complete change to what we've had up to now, and that is and so when you get up into the, let's say, the 10,000 to 30,000 range, what you're looking at is high in the sky. You're going to have, in a wide field telescope, so one of the things is astronomers have very different kinds of telescopes.
Yep.
They have the scalpels that look at one very precise thing in great detail, and they have the scoops that scoop up as much light as they can and are searching for new discoveries, right? And so these wide field telescopes obviously are much more prone to getting Starlinked.
Starlink.
It's a verb, is it?
It's a verb now. Yeah, I got Starlinked, meaning my astronomy image had a big bright streak right through the thing I was trying to look at.
Yeah.
In DOS, we actually have one of those.
I was
Actually,
gonna say, we're looking at this picture on the screen right now, and it's like, okay, big deal. It's like 2 little points of light. Just ignore it, like Photoshop it out or whatever. But then you get into what the telescope sees, especially for longer duration exposures or stacking or that sort of thing, and you end up with something that looks more like this, right?
Right, where the blurry thing is a comet, and then all the lines are a Starlink constellation.
Oh wow.
Recent deployment. Each one of these streaks is a satellite that's passed over during the exposure. So we take an exposure, and when you take a picture, right, with your camera, you just go click and it's done. It's like
done.
a second exposure. When I take an exposure on a mountain and telescope, it's probably a 10-minute exposure because I'm looking for super, super faint things.
Gotcha.
And I'm not looking for these stars that you can see in this picture. I'm looking for like the really faint, the very faintest smudges that you can see, right? And so there's a number of things that go wrong. Now, to be fair, right, it's not normally as bad as what you see there because that's only from the recently deployed constellations.
Right.
Don't get this sort of parallel streaks of many satellites in a typical
And
situation.
they're really close together. They're just starting to spread out, right?
Right, exactly. But with enough of them up there, you'll get 4 or 5 streaks like that in random directions, and in a typical image. And that's the thing is when the average number of streaks per image gets to be more than one, it gets very hard to mitigate, and there's a number of effects. And so when you're, and people go, oh yeah, you can like mask it with software. But if you're trying to measure, we're not trying to make a pretty image. We're trying to measure the brightness of this faint star to a 1% accuracy.
Right.
Right. And that there's a lot that goes into that, and it's very easy to screw up that calibration.
Yeah.
And I would imagine too, right? And I would imagine too, Jonathan, right? Like, because sometimes it's not just like measuring the brightness of it. Like, I mean, and to delete that, we're also talking about planet hunting telescopes and telescopes that are trying to find things at the extremes of our solar system. When if you're hoping to catch something as it is occulting a star, and a Starlink comes over at just that moment, you don't get a redo.
Well, that's exactly right. And another thing is if you're hunting for asteroids, right, like asteroids that might, kill us all or whatever.
No big deal.
You have to take multiple exposures to get the orbit. And so if you've taken 3 good exposures, but the third one is Starlinked, then all 3 are wasted.
Gotcha.
Right? And so there's all kinds of ways in which so one of the things, the brighter satellites, when you get the 4th magnitude Starlinks go over in your image, it doesn't just make a streak, it makes ripples throughout the field of view. It screws up the electronics.
Gotcha.
And so there's crosstalk between the different I don't do electronics, so I'm out of my depth here, but there's crosstalk between the widgets, and that's all. And so it so there are subtle, and there can be scattered light too. That if it raises the overall brightness level in the image by just a small amount, right, then suddenly you've lost the faintest objects. And in astronomy, there's always more faint objects than bright ones. So losing the faintest objects means you've lost 90% of the objects, right?
Yeah.
And so there's all kinds of subtle effects, and we're still learning from experience what the unexpected ones are. So this is a real problem if it gets to the level that we're talking about of tens of thousands of satellites.
Gotcha.
The other worry that I've had and that we've expressed is if they're really bright, if they're like 4th magnitude or 5th magnitude, which means 6th magnitude is like the faintest, bigger numbers are fainter. The faintest you can see with the naked eye in a dark sight is like 6 or 7, right? And so the stars you can see from Harvard Square or some city, right? Like Mag 2 probably, and so you're not going to be bothered. But if you go out into Walden Pond or somewhere nice that you're looking up and used to seeing, the real dark sky, you're seeing these 5th magnitude stars, and we can easily get now to a stage where there are more satellites than stars at the faint level, right? And just at the level of what you can see with the eye. And so it's not like, oh, there's these dots going about. It's like the background is kind of squirming.
Oh.
You know, you could get to a point where you see the whole night sky is like shimmering a bit or something, which I'm guessing it would like make you nauseous. And
Huh.
so yeah, that's like
Oh,
my
wow.
nightmare scenario. And I'm pleased to say that I think the changes that Starlink have made, that SpaceX have made, have reduced the brightness to the point where that's no longer a near-term threat. But that doesn't
Gotcha.
stop some other company doing the same thing.
Well, and
Let me just say one more thing, which is
yeah.
that Starlink have also just gotten approved, lowering their initial plan for a higher level constellation to back down to the 500 kilometers that their current ones are at. Whereas OneWeb, which is the rival, the company that's deploying right now, their satellites are at 1,200 kilometers. And so they're fainter, and so you'd think that's better.
Right.
And it is for the average person looking up in the sky, not wanting the constellations to go away, right? But for the professional astronomer, it's actually worse because for a given number of satellites, there's more of them visible from a particular point on the ground because they're higher, and
Ah.
they can see the sun for longer into the night.
Mhm.
Okay.
And they're also moving slower, and so they leave, the brightness on your image is higher.
Yeah.
Right.
I think
So
let me see if I can explain
that
that really quickly.
yeah, yeah.
and that
Because
first image is probably
I've got my pen here. So you're sitting on the surface of the Earth, right? Whoa, I'm drawing in white? That's not correct. Sorry. Redo.
because we're on
That's not a DOS illustration.
It's
No,
supposed
no,
to be
no.
it's supposed to be red. My pen color is red like that. So we're on the Earth and you're looking up, right? And a
Yeah.
telescope isn't just a line looking up. A telescope actually has a field of view like this, right?
Yeah.
And so what you're saying is you've got Starlinks that are down low, sort of like here. And so the number that are going to be in your little cross section of your field of view, it's going to be less satellite. You'll get less satellites in there. And if you go up what do we say, almost three times higher, more than 2 times higher up here, the field of view is going to cover more terrain. So you'll get more satellites in that field of view. Did I sort of summarize that correctly?
Right, but that's actually not the main effect. The main
Okay.
effect is that upper one is moving more slowly just because of
Okay.
and so it spends more time in that cone.
Ah.
And also it can its horizon is higher, right? So
Right.
more likely to be illuminated by the sun.
Mhm.
Ah, because you've got sunlight coming over like this way, right? And so you'll have more of a swath up here where they'll be illuminated. Down here
Right.
lower, the Earth is blocking, like hiding in the shadow of the Earth because they're close to the Earth.
Yeah.
Gotcha. And the other thing is just orbital mechanics. Down low, the lower orbits have to go faster, and the
That's
higher
right.
orbits go slower. And so they'll sort of
Right.
drift across instead of just sort of going across really quickly.
Right. And if you
Gotcha.
think about how many different places on that red curve of the Earth can see the given satellite,
Yep.
right? There's more observers going to be able to see the high satellite than the low satellite.
Then the low satellites. That makes
Yeah.
sense.
So if you put up, maybe this is a good time to put up that first plot with the curve showing the time of night.
Let's see. Was that Space Star or the Star?
Yes, that
Okay.
was the one. Yeah.
That one right there, right?
There we are. Right. And so this is a simulation that I did for the worst case, which is, let's suppose that OneWeb put up 48,000 satellites, but maybe it's the Chinese now. We don't know, right? And Starlink put up 30,000 satellites, and Kuiper put up 3,000. And so what I showed here is, so there's going to be a lot of satellites overhead, but some of them are not going to be illuminated by the sun. They're going to be in the Earth's shadow.
Right.
And so how many, if I'm sitting at the observatory in Chile in the middle of summer, which is the worst case, how many satellites do I see as the sun sets and then it gets into midnight and then the sun rises? And so from left to right across this plot is the time of night. And what you see is that these different colors, green is the Amazon constellation, magenta is the Starlinks, and red is the OneWebs.
Wow.
And you see that, and then the blue is the sum of them all. And what you see is that the OneWebs, the first thing you see is the OneWebs are dominating, right?
Yeah.
Even though there's the same number of satellites, more or less, as the Starlinks. but because they're higher, they contribute much more. And so you
Wow.
see like 4,500 OneWebs early in the evening compared to 1,000 Starlinks.
Wow.
And then as you go through the night, as the sun sets, and the vertical lines are like different levels of how many degrees below the horizon the sun is.
Okay.
So the final line is 18 degrees below, which is what astronomers call astronomical twilight, and normal people call night. And because we like it to be really, really, really dark, right? And so you see that the number dips, but even in the middle of the night, we've got in this simulation 2,500 Starlinks illuminated above your horizon in this particular configuration. But the Starlinks are all in the shadow. And so in the middle of the night, you're fine from the Starlinks, but you're not fine from the OneWebs. And so what this is saying is that it's not just the number of satellites, it's the technical details of the constellation architecture that are going to affect how badly we're hosed. And so in this configuration, if the OneWebs don't launch and the Starlinks do, we are, we're okay in the middle of the night. We can do our dark sky
Okay.
galaxies. But in the early evening near the horizon, and this is mostly satellites near the horizon I'm showing here. So
Right.
often astronomers don't like to look near the horizon because it's brighter there, and we don't like to look in twilight. But if you're trying to look at something which is near the sun, then you do have to look near the horizon at twilight. And so why would you want to look at something near the sun? Well, you might be interested in hunting for killer asteroids.
Right.
Which are going to be in orbit. Right. And so that's and then you use a wide field telescope with long exposures to hunt for faint dots that are just, near the horizon.
Not behaving in the way you think they should.
Right. And this is exactly where the satellite constellations are just going to completely hose you.
Yeah.
And so it depends both on the constellation configuration and on the science you're trying to do.
Right.
Yeah, and Jonathan, if I'm reading that correctly, that graph does not include the proposed Chinese constellation that we're still trying to kind of suss out what they actually are planning to do with it and how much it's going to be, right?
Yeah, my sense is the Chinese constellation is pretty similar to the OneWeb one in some respects, and so I haven't modeled it yet, but that's like next week's plan.
Next week's plan.
I think it's going to be, as they've described it, it has at least some of the satellites at this higher altitude of 1,000 kilometers or so, and so it's going to look like that OneWeb one, the red line.
Now, are there things that because there's two sort of follow-up questions to this that I'm sort of curious about, but my first one is, we saw SpaceX have a very earnest response to the astronomical community in what they tried to do with the Starlinks originally. But I what I'm seeing from here, what I'm assuming from here is that there hasn't been that sort of concern or that sort of cooperation from OneWeb, or has there, and just the altitude of their constellation negates these sort of mitigating factors like SpaceX has employed, or have they just not opted to do that?
Right. So they are they have engaged with us. They've only recently started engaging with this because they went through bankruptcy and had to reorganize stuff, and so they were really not around for 6 months last year when a lot of these conversations were happening, and so now they're back in the game. And I've talked with some of their engineers who are great. And usually, when I'm talking to the engineers, there's no problem, right? But except that they are committed to this 1,200 kilometer altitude, and that's intrinsically bad for us. And so it's not clear how well, without a change in that, it's not clear how much they can do to mitigate. But we're at least having the conversation now, so that's a start. And this, the trouble is, it's a little concerning to have to depend on the charity of mega corporations. And that's why we're also engaging the United Nations, the Committee of the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, to try and begin the discussion of, maybe the night sky is part of the environment, and maybe there should be some protections for it. And we're not, just to be clear, we're not saying, oh, mega constellations bad, kill them all. We're going,
Right.
let's see if we can find some reasonable compromise where we limit the number of satellites above a certain brightness at a certain height.
Right.
Yeah.
And kind of find a way that they can get their business case, but we can still see the sky.
Yeah, and the last question I sort of have on this, because I know, Das, we have a lot of good questions in the
We
queue
have tons of good
too.
questions. Yeah, so many questions.
Yeah, we really do. There was the announcement earlier today from senior White House administration officials that the National Space Council will continue, and one of the things that Vice President Harris has said is a goal of hers is to establish not just peaceful norms, but also normal operating procedures for space.
Yeah.
Is this a sort of intersection that you see as a possible route of conversation for the National Space Council?
That's an interesting idea, and I know that the American Astronomical Society is engaging the administration on some level, but I don't know if we got as high as the National Space Council. I think one of the things is within the United States, in general, even within a Democratic administration, the corporations get the ear of government much more easily than the scientists, because we have zero money, and so we'll see. Also, and one of the things I want to emphasize is that this is an intrinsically global problem. Solving it on the U.S. side isn't enough, and so, but we do want to at least push the U.S. Administration to sort of be aware of this and be on the right side in the international discussions. So yeah, we'll see. I think we're approaching this in as many different directions as we can, and I'm not privy to that particular set of discussions. I mean, this does bring us in though to the next topic I think you're going to want to talk about, which is the space junk and the space traffic management generally.
We have lots of stuff to talk about.
It does, but Das, I know we have a lot of good questions that our viewers that those watching have been sending in. So before we do go to orbital tracking, and I do have a segue to that I want to employ too, but I know we have some questions from our viewers too.
So I'm going to get some specific questions, but there are a lot of questions around. I'm trying to come up with the right way to frame this, so I'm just going to jump into it. Right, we were showing this image for an awful long time. I had it up on the screen. We were sort of looking at this, and it's like, man, we're trying to image this comet, and it got Starlinked. And the question is, how cherry-picked is this image? Is this like it happened this one time, and it's really not that big of a problem? I've got some personal experience with Starlink because I was able to walk out on my back deck and see a recently launched Starlink constellation. Y'all might not be able to see it in the preview for the guest on the show, but I caught 60 Starlink satellites, and I could actually count every single satellite going across the sky from my back deck. But this was because they were the older versions in 2019, and they were just launched. They were just spreading out. This is also sort of cherry picked because it's not like looking like this every day.
Absolutely.
What do they look like normally once they get deployed?
Well, this was the whole point of doing the simulations, right?
Yeah.
Because you're absolutely right. At the moment, it's not such a horrible problem.
Okay.
Right? What we're trying to do the math of is, okay, but that's with 1,000 satellites up.
Right.
What's it going to be like with 30,000? What's it going to be like with 100,000? Right? And so yes, absolutely. On a typical night right now in 2021, it's an occasional annoyance.
An occasional annoyance. Gotcha.
It's becoming noticeably more common. But it's not terrible yet, but it's getting noticeable enough that it's in line with the math that we're doing that tells us that it will be terrible if all of these satellites are deployed.
Keep going down this path. So here, I'm going to bring this up really quickly. We didn't show this earlier, but this is sort of the current state of the Starlink constellation, right, Chris? Oh, this webpage is not
Yeah.
centered, but that's okay. This is sort of what's
Yeah.
been launched right now, and you can sort of see, Jonathan, you said it's not just the U.S. is not just the place to solve this. Orbits don't work that way, especially these orbits don't work that way. So if you launch a satellite, you want coverage all over the United States at this altitude. By definition, it's going to go over South America, it's going to go over Russia, it's going to go over the entire world. Right? At some point in the rotation of the planet and the way the orbits work, it's not like you just launch them and the United States is the only country that's affected, right?
Right. And not only that, it's not like the US satellites are in one place and the Russian or the Chinese satellites are in another, right? All of the orbits are interpolating. And so it is both from the point of view of space traffic management and from the point of view of the astronomy, it's an intrinsically global problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So I'm going to start grabbing a couple questions here. Go ahead, Chris.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, as you do that, because I just wanted to point out. I mean, like, but you can see, Jonathan, exactly what you're saying there. It's not that one might come overhead. It's that you might have several coming over and in your field of view at the same time, because you can see it just in this current graphic. You can see how spread out they are, but you can also see the trains that are still coming over.
Yep.
And you can really get that globalized sense of what just this constellation is right now.
Yeah, and I'm going to link this up if anybody wants to see this directly. This is actually from the Heavens Above website. So there is a link if you want to go check that out. Heavens Above is a cool app you can have on your phone to do different astronomical observations. You put your location in and it's like, oh, here's where you can see this constellation or satellite going over or whatever. So there is the link to that if you want to check that out directly.
Heavensabove.com, Chris Pete, amazing website. It's the best. I super recommend it.
Excellent. So we talked about this one. I see one from Rolf Anderson here saying, are the other providers also cooperating with astronomers? And you said you have communicated some, but in some cases there's only so much they can do.
Right. And also most of them are at an earlier stage in their process, right?
Gotcha.
So I don't think the cooperation has been as extensive as it has with SpaceX, but yeah, they're mostly willing to talk, and it's always hard though. Until you actually see a change implemented, it's hard to know, what's
take going on.
The nice words.
If this is too out there, let me know. Just like look at me and shake your head. But do you feel like the companies are communicating in earnest? Or are they just saying, no, we're totally trying to work on it. Trust us. I see a Starlink and I want it painted black. We're doing it, whatever. Or are they actually trying to solve this problem?
No, I think they are.
Okay.
And I think, the question is, is the motivation because they really care about the astronomers or because they don't want bad press? I think it's probably a mixture of both, depending on, which person you're talking about within the company. But no, I do really believe that certainly at SpaceX, where I have, a little more insight and I've talked to the engineers, they're really working hard on this, and they really want to do what they can. They want to do what they can for us within the context of still being able to make a profit.
Right. Because at some point you need a satellite that's there. If you're going to bounce a signal off an antenna, it's got to be in a position, right?
Exactly. And the painting dark thing, that wasn't going to go anywhere because painting it dark makes it overheat. And then you have a faint satellite, but it's not doing the job.
Then you have to add radiators to it, and then it's even bigger, so it's going to die.
So the visors work much better, and so that and that's the SpaceX iterative way of trying some things and finding a better way. And so they're certainly I think you have to give them that much credit, and it's difficult for me because they'd say I can't quite we're still worried, right? But absolutely acknowledge that they've been seriously trying on this.
Good deal. So here's a good one real quick. I'm going to grab a couple more here and we'll see if we can get through a couple of them. Would it be possible to use accurate orbital parameters to precisely block out the satellites from your images just as they're passing through? So if SpaceX gave you the precise, like my air quotes there, location of every single one of their satellites, couldn't you just program your software to ignore them? I've seen that online a lot.
Yeah. So what you would have to do, right? You don't just need software, you need hardware. Because what you'd really need is like a shutter that could very quickly go over the front of your telescope
hide the Starlink.
Yeah, hide the sky for that period, and then open again, right? And then your 5 minute exposure would have 5 seconds missing in the middle of it, and you wouldn't have the streak, and you'd have to have the electronics to record how long the shutter was closed for to get the accurate exposure time
Right.
correct.
Ah,
And remember, we're talking about there are thousands of professional telescopes in the world, all
Right.
different designs, and sizes and shapes, and so it's a non-trivial engineering investment for each of these thousands of telescopes,
Right.
and so it's not so easy, and that only works as long as the average number of satellites coming over at any one time is less than one, right? I mean,
Right. Exactly.
there are a lot of these mitigations that you can imagine that kind of work at the 10,000 satellite level, but then if you get up to the 200,000 or 300,000 satellite level, which might be coming, then it just fails because
Right.
it's satellites all the time, and you can't blank out all the time. And
Well,
then so that's one thing, and then there's the software kind of scrubbing the image, and as we discussed, just to the accuracies that astronomers are trying to measure things. For a lot of cases, that just doesn't work. Although we are trying, we're developing software to do that as best we can, and so there are some applications for which it's okay, right? And
Right.
the one of the groups I'm working with is has the task of right now we're just at the level of speccing the software, right? Of figuring out what software we need, who might do it, what are the requirements, and so maybe in a year or so we might have that kind of software available. But it's
Yeah.
again, the trouble is, right, it's like, again, the cameras are we have spectrographs, we have imagers, we have different wavelengths, and so it's not one size fits all.
Yeah. I think the other part
yeah.
of it is, there's a company out there deploying a satellite constellation and they're making money off of it. It's a profit thing for them. And then you're talking about reaching into your infinite astronomy budget, right? Which is bottomless. You never run out of money, right? And you
Oh
have
yeah,
to develop
right.
software and special telescopes and shutters, and you're spending money to overcome the problem that was created by another company that's making money off of it. So there's definitely a balance that needs to be struck
Sure,
there,
and
right?
maybe we can shake down the companies for some contributions, and
There you go.
that
It,
that that's not out of that's not unreasonable. But even with if we did have infinite money, which clearly we very much don't,
right.
uh, it's the resources of the people who are expert enough in this. There's a finite number of people who are expert enough in this to address this, and if they're working on this, they're not working on
Right.
discovering quasars, or
Yep. I
uh,
do the exact same thing with Chris's audio, right? So Chris lives in the sunroom there and it thunderstorms and he's got air conditioners and I can mitigate all that. I can spend time where I'm like, okay, sound trigger, let's clean this, get a special microphone, et cetera, et cetera. But we spend money and we take time away from doing other
Mhm.
things so that we're not hearing the hail hitting his roof. Like I'd rather it was just quiet there and then I could focus on other things. Same thing with you. Sky's dirty. Even if you can deal with it, it's an opportunity cost thing, right?
exactly,
Yeah.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
that sort of takes us into this other question. I think this may have to be the last question on this because we could have spent this entire show just talking about Starlink. Um,
Apparently, that's what I'm realizing is what we could have done.
no.
Yeah.
So what about this? They're just going to come and save you by launching telescopes up above the satellite constellations. Why
Yeah.
can't you just move the satellites out there? They'll do that for free for you. Then just use that. Have you heard that argument
Oh,
against dirtying the
often,
night sky?
often. Like, oh, you think we haven't thought of that, right? I mean, guys, come on. So here's the thing. Like I said, we have thousands of professional telescopes, all of different designs, optimized to do different kinds of science.
Right.
Um, each one of those, even if SpaceX gave us a free launch, right? e- to make a space version of each one of those would just be in the trillions, right?
Right.
And it's because it's not this is not like just an Earth imaging satellite that you come off a production line. The requirements on pointing and on instrumentation and so on are more challenging in there. So it's I do think that 100 years from now we're going to have to.
Right.
100 years from now, there's going to be, not 10,000 Starlinks in Earth orbit, but 10,000 ISSs,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
And astronomy is just going to have gone into space, and we're going to have to bite that bullet.
Right.
And hopefully, on a 100-year timescale, we can do that, and it will be cheap and all of that. But on a 20 or 30-year timescale, it's just not realistic. It's
Right.
not remote. You can give us 1 or 2 space telescopes, maybe, but that does
Thank you.
not solve the problem,
Right.
right?
It's the same sort of thing. I
Right.
mean, even if you got a free launch, like you said, you have to design it and build it, and designing something that's going to operate in space as opposed to the top of a mountain is going to cost a lot more money. And then even if the launch is free, you've got to maintain it. And it's a whole lot easier to drive to the observatory on top of the mountain with a truck than it is to launch something out there to service the satellite, right? How many times have we serviced an imaging satellite? It's not many, and the answer is Hubble, I think, right? Isn't that?
Yeah,
There's
that's
others.
basically right. Hubble 5
Yeah.
times, I think, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, and that's right. And so, yeah, I think this century, no, that's not
Right.
that's not a realistic solution. And I don't care how much you bring down the cost.
Gotcha. So
Yeah.
there we could literally have done an entire show just talking about this. There's still things, there's still drawings. Like I still want to draw about how the sun is blocked by the earth and then satellites here and shallow says we'll have to do
Well,
that in like the bonus
I
reel.
have those drawings. And
Yes.
if you go to my website,
Okay.
I'm saying to the viewers, if you go to the website planet4589.org and Jonathan's Space Report and
Yep.
navigate to the Starlink simulations webpage.
You know I can make them see this, right? Where's the Starlink simulations webpage?
If you go to Astrophysics,
Astrophysics, got it.
and then if you go to Starlink simulations, which is showing up on the left nav bar there.
There it is, Starlink simulations.
Yeah. And then on this page, I have lots of relevant documents and presentations by me that in some of the presentations you'll find exactly the drawing that you're talking about. We're not going to go for it now.
Yeah, I'm
But,
going to link it. I'm going to link this page to people in chat. You will spend days looking through all of the papers. If you're truly interested in this stuff, go to the website there, and there's tons of stuff that you can read through. I'll link you directly, but in the interest of time, let's hop on to the next topic, shall we? Which is
Okay.
also covered on the
Yeah.
webpage.
Yes. So I kind of wanted to start this conversation with one of the more recent launches that took place, but not the Starlink one. Last week we had the successful launch of the Tianyi module for the new Chinese space station.
Right?
And specifically, I want to focus on the core stage of the Shenzheng 5B. It was dropped off in about a circular 800, 185-ish kilometer orbit, which I thought was really good in terms of what it was able to do, because that sort of keeps it in the realm where it'll re-enter in 2 to 4 weeks, and it's not a huge debris hazard from an orbital standpoint. But this sort of brought up the question in my mind. Not all rockets have the ability to do that because of some of the places they're sending these satellites. So how many defunct objects do we sort of have up there right
wow.
now that we don't have control of?
Well, before you say, I want to slightly correct. I want to slightly
Yeah.
push back on what you said, because it's fine. It's going to come down in a few days, but it's going to come down in a few days uncontrolled, and it's a
Right.
22-ton rocket stage. It's going to be that, and the one that came down last year of the same type are the 4th and 5th biggest uncontrolled reentries in history.
Did anything
Yeah.
reach the ground on the last one, or is it that big?
Debris damaged some villages in Ivory Coast.
No
West-
kidding.
Wow.
In uncontrolled, that's sort of a deal. I mean, that's sort of a big deal if
Yeah.
it's uncontrolled. You don't know exactly
You
where
don't
it's
know
going to come down.
come down until after it's already re-entered, and it had these long metal rods, like 15-meter long metal rods that were slicing through the atmosphere and
Wow.
smashed into buildings in these villages in Ivory Coast. And luckily no one was hurt, but
Jeez.
over like a
Wow.
100-mile radius they found debris that was not just a little lump on the ground, but like big hardware that
Yeah.
actually caused damage. And we
Yeah.
could expect potentially the same thing from this core stage too. So, I think the fact that, normally when there's anything more than about 5 tons, we try and bring it down under control nowadays.
Right.
And so
there's actually graveyards where we try to put them in the Pacific or something like that. Aren't there
right.
targeted areas?
Depends where, but yeah, on launch, for example, you remember the shuttle, right, had the external tank, right? There's a big object, and they deliberately put it in a suborbital trajectory, so
Right.
they target its reentry on the first orbit, and made the shuttle do the final orbit insertion burn. Whereas it'd be much easier to go directly to orbit, leave off the tank, and not have to do the ohms burn.
Right.
Have left this tank do an uncontrolled reentry, and they didn't want that. And that was 1981, right? And so this the Ariane does the same thing with its core stage. So this is really kind of unacceptable, this design. And I think maybe what happened is they originally designed the Long March 5A, if you like, with the upper stage to put stuff in geo. Then went, we can use we can use it without the upper stage to put space station modules in orbit. And by that stage, it was too late to go, we need to make this engine restartable.
Right.
Yeah.
That's an important point.
The only thing I can think of that explains why they're being so irresponsible. But still, they need to add a system to this, to vent the leftover propellant in a particular direction so that they can deorbit it, because this is not good.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry for the rant, but I need
No.
That's an important point, and I'm going to link it back to Starlink really quickly, because one of the things you hear about Starlink, it's in this low orbit, and so if one fails or something like that, the atmospheric drag will bring it down out of orbit. It won't be space junk in space forever. When something deorbits, it's important where it deorbits and what's deorbiting. So you got a big honking thing like a space station piece or core stage or something like that. That can hit the ground, and if it's not controlled, it can cause damage. If you've got something that's smaller and sort of made like a pancake or whatever, that's more likely to burn up, like a high drag to mass ratio.
And it depends what materials it's made of, too.
Yes.
So Starlink is designed, as they say, to be fully demisable. Maybe it is, but anyway, so yeah, it's not a 22-ton core stage; it's a 0.2-ton satellite.
Right.
So it's going to mostly burn up. It's going to be fine. So I'm not super concerned about the Starlinks re-entering.
Right.
Right. I'm much more concerned about these big beasts that you just, it's not good.
Gotcha.
So to answer Chris's question, we're currently, we don't know how much stuff there is in orbit because the small stuff we can't see. But if you go to the stuff that's big enough to track, to go in the US satellite catalog.
How's that?
Yeah, exactly. Right now, we are tracking 22,000 objects in orbit, of which 4,000 are active satellites.
Wow.
And that in itself is amazing. Just a few years ago, it was only 1,000, and now it's 4,000 active ones. But that leaves 18,000 tracked objects that are junk of various kinds.
And are big enough to track, because there's bolts and bits of foil and stuff like that. That's insulation thrown out of the ISS.
In low orbit, we can track down to a few inches, down to 10 centimeters.
Wow. Okay.
So it's pretty comprehensive, and which not coincidentally is also the size of like the smallest typical CubeSats. And I'm trying to bring up this plot that I gave you. To show you how things are changing in low Earth orbit. And so this is a bit of a complicated plot, but I'm gonna take you through it. And there's 4 graphs here, and they are different kinds of junk versus time from 2005 to today. And the top left is small and high. Which will go small and high, big and high, small and low, big and low.
Okay.
And so high means above 600 kilometers, but still in Leo. I'm just looking at low Earth orbit here. So 600 to 2,000 kilometers. And what you see for the small stuff in the top left is that since 2010, it hasn't changed much. It's pretty flat.
Right.
And there are different kinds of junk here. There's like dead payloads and abandoned rocket. Well, actually, mostly it's here is so the green is like mostly exploded rocket stage fragments and things like that. The yellow is the single Iridium Cosmos collision. The black is the Chinese anti-satellite test of 2007, right?
Yeah.
And so there's all of this, like 12,000 pieces of, here you are,
Yeah,
12,000.
get it a little bit bigger.
Yeah. And so, but the message I want to show here is there's a lot of small junk in this higher LEO, but it hasn't changed. The environment hasn't changed much in the past 10 years. And similarly, to go to the top right, if you look at the big junk, and by big, I mean more than 100 kilograms. And more than 100 kilograms, you see, it's basically the same story. So the bottom, the magenta is dead rocket stages.
Mm-hmm.
The brown is dead payloads, things that used to be working but
Wow.
weren't. And the red is working payloads. And there is a significant increase in the number of working payloads in this upper part of LEO that are 100 kilograms and up. But it's still not the majority. You're still dominated by junk.
Right. By the
Right.
dead payloads and the rocket stages.
And it's slow growth. It's not shooting up. So the situation above 600 kilometers, where, by the way, things stay in orbit for centuries.
Right.
Right? These things are not coming down anytime soon. But it's fairly stable. It's not shooting up. Now, if we go to the bottom left,
There we go.
this is small objects, things that are less than 100 kilograms, below 600 kilometers. So what I call lower LEO.
Right.
And lower LEO, I'm trying to sort of, popularize this idea that there's a lower LEO and an upper LEO.
Okay.
Because below about 600 kilometers, things naturally re-enter on a kind of solar cycle time scale. So 1 or 2 solar cycles, so within 25 years.
Right.
Right? And often within 1 year or less. So the density of the atmosphere gets so much higher below 600 kilometers that things re-enter relatively quickly.
Yeah. Let me hop on that real quick for people that might not understand what we're talking about. What happens? Space isn't a hard and fast line. It's not like all of a sudden you go from I'm in the air to I'm in space. We'll talk more about that later. But the atmosphere gets thinner and thinner the higher you go, and so when you're down low, when you're sort of closer to the ground, and I use 400, 600 kilometers is close to the ground, right? That's still relatively close to the ground compared to like being on the moon. So when you're low like that, there's more dense atmosphere, and that air will drag you down. If you've ever stuck your hand out of a car window, you feel it pushing your hand back. It's the exact same thing in orbit. When you're in those lower orbits, you have air that's resisting you. That drag will bring your stage down.
Right. And the thing is, like, it's very, very thin air, right? But
Yep.
the thing about when you stick your hand out of the car window is how much wind do you feel?
Yep.
Right? Depends on how dense the air is, but it also depends on how fast you're going.
Right.
And it depends on the square of how fast you're going. 10 times as fast, 100 times as much wind force. And so when you're going at orbital velocity, even and stick your head out of the spaceship. Bad idea.
Do that. NASASpaceflight, not responsible for.
Then even though the air is very, 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 very thin, it's like a lab vacuum. There's still enough of it that you're going so fast that you really feel that headwind.
You run into a lot of it because you're going through what little there is very quickly, and you
Right.
get higher. Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, and I was going to say that this is exactly why we have to periodically use the Progress or the Northrop Grumman Cygnus vehicles to reboost the International Space Station to keep it in its roughly 410-kilometer orbit. And since we're talking about low LEO, this is exactly what we're concerned about with the Hubble Space Telescope, because without the ability to send something up there to reboost it, it will just naturally come back into the atmosphere kind of within the next 15, 20-ish years, if nothing is done. So that's sort of the regime that we're talking about, where you have to reboost or it's coming in if you don't do anything.
Exactly. So that's low LEO. And what I want to show you here is how different this graph looks from the ones for upper LEO. That these are the small objects in low LEO. And back in 2010, these sort of green and yellow and orange colors are the sort of small junk kind of stuff, and they were dominating. But then this brown color is the dead payloads, and the red color is the active payloads. They're now dominating just in the past 5 years or so.
Yeah.
That red spike is going up. This is the Cubesat Revolution. Right? You hear about it, but here it is visible in the data quantitatively.
Huh.
that the population of small things in low Leo is now completely dominated by CubeSats and not by
You know,
the
one
at
and you
least,
know, one thing that is fascinating to me on this graph is we talk so much about Starlink because they're launched so rapidly and there are just so many of them, but you can't even really ascertain the line of
oh no, but
Starlinks on
that's
that one
because
yet.
Starlink is more than 100 kilograms. This is just the small ones.
Oh, my
Right.
apologies. Yes.
That's my
Right, right,
next.
right.
Okay, now
The
I
next
can
graph.
reveal. Right,
Okay.
which is we go to the bottom right graph, which is the big crap
Wow.
low Leo.
Never
There's
mind. There
Starlink,
we go.
Chris. There's Starlink.
And the cyan color is Starlink, right?
Jeez.
And so yeah,
It's
for the
almost like I
big,
knew what was coming.
yeah, for the big stuff in low Leo, we are now completely dominated by Starlink,
Wow.
right?
Yeah.
And that's why, and that's the astronomy message, right? Is that's why it's not just what Elon said when they first went up, right? Is oh, there's thousands of objects in space already. What's another few thousand? But the thing is that for things that are big and low and therefore bright, Starlink is completely running the table right now. It's completely dominating, and
More
that's
than
just in the
2/3
past
right
couple
now,
of years.
right?
Sorry?
Like more than 2/3 right now. It's
Yeah.
500 for the non-Starlink stuff, and then Starlink goes well up above 15, 16, 1700.
Yeah.
Exactly, and so that's and this is only with a fraction of the constellation deployed right now,
Yeah.
right? And so already the traffic of big stuff in low Leo is completely dominated by Starlink. And,
Yeah.
and so those two graphs, that bottom graph showing this big change in both the CubeSats and in the Starlinks in the past few years, right, shows that we are in the middle of a revolution in the space traffic environment in lower Leo. But in upper Leo, things are not changing that much. But yet, with
Yet.
one they may, but in lower Leo, things have changed out of all recognition in just the past few years. And
Well,
so
we've got our
that's the message I wanted to
Wow.
get across.
got our own low orbit hockey stick going on here.
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
Yeah. That's a great analogy. Yeah.
Yeah. Jeez. I mean, I've never seen it
So-
visualized this way.
No,
Right,
that's why
Chris?
when I first made,
Right. Yeah.
figured it out sort of from the launch rate, and then went, okay, I should make these graphs.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only when you separate it out into the lower and upper Leo that it kind of becomes so clear.
Yeah.
So what do we do about this? And not so much the growing number of active satellites in orbit, since yes, they do pose. We talked about their correlation with astronomy, but they're doing active science. So I want to kind of focus on the dead payloads, the
Yeah.
spent
I think
part
you
of
have
this.
to put them together though, because there's an overall, not from the astronomy point of view, but from the collision avoidance.
Yeah.
And,
Yes.
and so I think what this says is that the environment in space is changing faster than the regulations are, and we have to get our act together. And we need an international. It's not enough to have the Space Force in the U.S. warn operators, oh, your satellite's going to go close to his satellite,
Right.
which is what they do right now.
Mhm.
We need a real air traffic control that says satellite A go up 10 kilometers, satellite B go down 10 kilometers. That's sort of centrally managed, and that means international, because if the
Yeah.
Space Force tell the Chinese to move, they're going to, they're going to.
Yeah, exactly. How's that gonna go?
Right.
Well,
And so I think we need an international space traffic management agency that's going to not just do the space situational awareness of where is everything and where are they going and are they about to hit each other, but the management of, yeah, you go here and you go there. And,
Right.
and that's my belief. And as part of that, we also need a space garbage truck fleet that is going to remove. So people worry about these tens of thousands of objects in space, right? But if you do the math again of what's going to set off the Kessler chain reaction that's going to making the gravity wave or whatever, it's actually dominated by collisions between the big objects, like the Iridium Cosmos collision that we had.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? And so you can greatly reduce the threat by getting rid of in that upper right graph that I showed
You got it. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. The big stuff in upper Leo that is mostly junk, and it's like lots of old Soviet rocket stages and things like that, right?
Right.
And dead, iridiums and whatever, and so it's about half rocket stages and half dead payloads, right?
Yeah.
And so and it's about 1,500 objects, right? So
Yep.
If you can get rid of the biggest 10% of those, even, you've done a long way to controlling the problem, mitigating the problem. It's another
Right.
part of it.
Yeah.
And so I see, attacks on space users funding funding garbage trucks like the Northrop Grumman MEV or
Uh-huh.
the Astroscale things to go up and just deorbit the bigger pieces of junk.
Yeah.
So this is part of what I wanted to touch on, but I want to stop actually and go back to this idea of a space traffic control center, because that I didn't actually think of that, because I was actually going to try to focus on the how do we do this? How do we go up and we clean up these things? Because I know, talking to Northrop Grumman, one thing they said is that's certainly something MEV could do if someone came and wanted to purchase
wanted
one
to
from
pay
us.
for it. Yeah.
Right. No one seems to want to just do this to do it. But so I guess my question is sort of to Jonathan, twofold. How do you think something like an international, space traffic control system could work in that regard? Who would oversee that? Would that be the UN, or would that be setting up a supranational entity for that? But then also, how do you view it, that we should try to incentivize companies to go up and clean up the upper Leo debris that you're talking about
Yeah.
here?
Well, I think the lever you have on the companies, right, is the launch licenses. And it's a little unfair in that you're then going after ones who are launching now and not the people who were launching 30 years ago who made the jump. But still, I don't see any other way around that. And so I think it's got to be a combination of taxpayer money and some kind of levy on the use of space. If you want to launch something, you got to pay for bringing one thing down or something like that.
It's like a bottle deposit when you get a bottle of Coke or something like that, and you pay an extra 5 cents for the bottle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Got to be some. Those are the two possibilities, right? It's either just amortized through everybody through taxes, or it's amortized through the users for a use tax. And some combination of that has got to be the way that it goes. And so I think that's how you do it. And then you then contract out to some space debris removal agency that hopefully is internationally managed, and that maybe it's only 3 countries that get together and agree, to make a start on this, right? And maybe Europe. I have great hopes for Europe. They're getting their space situational awareness stuff together finally. They have a lot of smart people who care about this, and they're not quite as in hoc to the corporations, and they're a bit more, no one hates them, right? Like the way that US and China hate each other, right? And so so they could be the nucleus of an agreement, I think. And maybe it's the way, as it often is in software projects, right? Is one person makes it start to happen, and they have a good model, and other people buy in. And there are some international law issues. A lot of the debris is old Soviet stages. So you need the Russians' permission before you're going to go and dispose of them.
Salvage them.
So that's what
space.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what I was going to ask is, we Sputnik sort of answered the legality question of overflying other countries in space, right? Because we don't consider that airspace, and you can do that legally. But if there's a spent Soyuz U stage up there from the 1970s, the US can't just go grab that and deorbit it, even if we don't do anything other than just deorbit it. We can't do that without Russia's permission, can we?
That is correct. Russia still, in the legal phrase, I think, exercises jurisdictional control over that dead rocket stage, even though there's nothing they can do about it. But they have legal ownership of it, and so yeah, you can't, if you go and remove it without their permission in advance, then you've basically done an anti-satellite attack.
Right.
And you know, that's not good. So, and that's, you know, that's another issue that's touchy, right? Because
Right.
debris removal technology is anti-satellite technology, right? And because if you have that capability, you could go, you know, I could go and send my debris removal truck to remove HST.
A fusion drive would also be a very
Yeah.
good weapon if you had one. Like, that's
Yeah.
the thing. And there's two of those on the graph.
Things. A knife is an implement, a kitchen implement, or a weapon.
Yep.
And so, but it's particularly touchy in this area. So I think there are, you know, the space lawyers are not very optimistic about this in the near term. Unfortunately, I personally think that the argument is so strong that they just need to get their act together and agree on it. But yeah, it's there are all kinds of fascinating issues around this.
Yeah. Really quickly, I want to touch on this because I've seen a couple people sort of making this point or asking this question. Why is Starlink such a big deal if there's this many objects already in orbit that nobody's doing anything about? Like, who cares if we had another 1,000 Starlinks that says there's 12,000 things up there already? I sort of know the answer, but
Well, the answer
these are
is
small objects.
which is like they're higher.
Yeah.
It's lower and they're brighter.
Right.
So, astronomy point of view, they're a big deal. And also, then we're talking. This is 12,000 small objects,
Right.
Upper Leo, but only, you know, 2,000 big objects,
Right.
and we're talking 30,000 big objects.
And that's where we get down into this sort of graph where, yes, there are objects up there, but the big graph there that has 12,000 things, that's under 100 kilograms. And some of those are down to the sizes you can track. You said like 10 to 12 inches or something like that?
Yeah.
Like smaller things.
Yeah. 10 centimeters. So
10 centimeters. Oh, 10 centimeters. Sorry. And so the Starlinks are much bigger than that, especially once they unfurl their solar panel. They're lower, they're brighter, etc.
Right, and so that's 100 times bigger than a lot of these debris objects. So yeah, so you've got to compare like with like.
Yeah.
And so yeah, no, they really are these. We're talking about a large number of objects in a large number of large objects in low orbits.
Right.
And
intentionally, like we're putting them there actively right now on purpose.
Right.
Not stuff that exists that needs to be cleaned up or whatever. I know, Chris, we had some stuff. We were talking about the space traffic control, right? And one of those visualizations was Leo Labs, which is one of the organizations. I don't know, explain what that is, if you could.
Yeah, so Leo Labs is an organization that tracks things in low Earth orbit. To the casual sort of space viewer, you are most likely to have heard of them from last year and a couple of times, because they will use their Twitter account to sort of say, hey, like, we're tracking a potential collision between these two objects. Here's the current miscalculation. But I know, Jonathan, we've also had some things with them where I know they've sort of put out some things that have said, we think there's going to be a collision, and the larger astronomical community sort of looks at the two line elements, the orbital elements that tell us where things are and give us the prediction, or give us the ability to sort of predict where they might be. I know there's been some concern about like potentially hyping collisions where the overall community doesn't think there actually is a potential or a large potential for a collision.
I don't know about the overall community. I mean, there are different sources of orbital data, right? As you say, there's the Space Force, the 18th Space Control Squadron, and their data, and then you've got Leo Labs and their data,
right?
A couple of other companies in the same field, and so they don't quite agree. Now, and so in particular, in a couple of these hyped events, the Space Force data didn't show as close a predicted approach as the Leo Labs one. But even after the fact, we don't know who was right.
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 And so what this says is we're still working on the covariances, which is the term of art for the uncertainties
Right.
on what this data is. And so, and you have different things. I mean, if Joe says this is a 20-meter miss plus or minus 100 meters, and Al says this is a 1 kilometer miss plus or minus 10 kilometers.
Oh.
Right? Those are consistent.
Right.
Right? And so, and it's not quite that extreme, right, in a typical case, but it's like if the uncertainties are very different sizes, then also the predictions can be very different and still be consistent with each other, right?
Gotcha.
And so and so I think there's still a lot of work to be done on this, and particularly I want to call out Professor Mariba Jah at the University of Texas Austin, who has a website, Astriograph, I think, in which he's the one person who's actually systematically trying to compare the prediction of different sources and show here's where they say it is, here's where they say it is, and look at this discrepancy.
Yeah.
And so that's worth looking at for people who are interested in that kind of work.
Yeah. What?
So
Go, Chris.
Oh,
go.
sorry, Dos. Go ahead.
No.
Yeah. So I guess my because I know, man. I mean, I feel bad because we had 3 other topics we want to get to, and we've got like 10 minutes left.
We
like
haven't
we
even
really
crossed the carbon
overplanned
line
this.
yet.
I know.
Back.
But so I guess my overall question is, how big of a deal is the sort of non-agreement sometimes of what the predicted misses are? And I'm going to ask this in terms of the Crew Dragon Crew 2 event that just occurred, where right after shortly after liftoff, after the crew had already taken off their pressure suits, they were told, you got to put your pressure suits back on, we have a possible conjunction coming up. And of course Dragon was fine, and the crew is fine and on the space station now. But how big of a deal is the non-agreement on these sources? And when you have non-agreement on them, I assume you just err on the side of caution whenever you have a spacecraft that can maneuver out of the way, and it's safe to maneuver out of the way, because I know you always don't want to necessarily move in these situations.
Right. I mean, I think I'm a bit on Leo Lab's side here. They've taken a bit of flack for overhyping, but the reality is that there are a lot of these close approaches, and we do need to be worried about them.
Right.
And so raising awareness about it, I mean, you don't want to cry wolf, but at the same time,
you don't want to get hit by space debris either.
Yeah, right, exactly. So
I think I liken it to like down here on the east coast of Florida, especially like the Cape North, where everyone will always say every hurricane season, oh, don't worry, don't evacuate, they always turn north. And I'm like, yeah, until the day the monster doesn't.
Yeah.
Right. You know.
And so this is managing risk in the presence of uncertainty, right? Which is, for anyone involved in spaceflight, that's our whole game, really. And so it's judgment calls, and it's you just have to keep identifying what the biggest sources of uncertainty are and trying to beat them down to get more accurate predictions.
Yeah, I want to hit on that really quickly.
The fact that there are now isn't, for like 50 years, Space Force, as it is now, was the only source, and so there was no visibility into the fact that these things were actually unreliable.
Weren't as
right.
This is something that
now we're actually having to get a comparison, and we're going, oh, okay, so we don't really know where things are.
Yeah, a lot of people don't understand that you just point your radar at the sky and you know exactly where the little piece of debris is, and that's not how it works. Even active satellites, we don't know exactly where they are. We sort of have this cone of probability, or this sphere of probability as to where they are.
An hour from now, right?
Yeah.
Presence of drag and solar activity and things like that.
And so there's all sorts of things affecting it. At any given point, we don't know exactly where everything is. We just have a good idea of about where it is. And that's where these uncertainties come in. One set of data may think it's about here, another set of data may think it's about here. And they're certainly close. Like if you looked up, you wouldn't tell the difference. Well, you might tell the difference. I wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But we don't know exactly where this stuff is. And that gets us into the I want to hit on this really quickly because we hear
Yeah.
all the time about how the Starlink satellites, oh, they'll just move themselves out of the way. No big deal. It's all automated. They just move themselves wherever they need to avoid space junk. Is that good?
Yeah, you see, one of my problems with that is I have no idea how this magic system works, right? They have not said. And so what data set are they working from to understand that there's a satellite that they might hit?
Right.
Is it just that they're uploading to the satellites the latest Space Force satellite TLE catalog? In which case, that has mistakes in it and it's not accurate enough for this, and they could run into trouble, right? And so, or are they, maybe they're also folding in data they get directly from OneWeb to avoid them, or do they just have information on on their own fleet, and they're good at avoiding each other but not at avoiding other people?
Right.
And so we don't have enough they haven't said enough for us to understand that, right? And so how can you, if I'm another operator, how can I have confidence in that if I don't have that visibility into their system?
You've got something moving unpredictably. It's like a driver changing lanes without signaling. How do you know that all of a sudden the satellite's not going to move into your lane?
Right. And that's
Yeah.
one of the big problems as we go to this mega constellation era, right? Is if A moves to avoid B and C moves to avoid D, the A and C are now on a collision course, right?
Right.
And if you get that to the point where you have 100 satellites in the same altitude range all maneuvering at once, right? That probability becomes non-negligible.
Right.
Yeah.
Yo, we're
And-
running out of time. Go, Chris. We're running
Yeah,
out of
well,
time.
I was going to say, because we are running out of time, but I think
Mhm.
that goes back to your larger point, Jonathan, of like stressing the need for a space flight traffic system like we have for air traffic control, here inside of the atmosphere. Jonathan, one thing I do want to ask you, I know we have our big final conversation that we have to have, but I do want to touch on your current research in X-ray astronomy and your work with the Chandra Institute and the Chandra X-ray Observatory. Can you tell us some about what you're currently working on and sort of what you're most excited about right now in terms of studying in the field of X-ray astronomy?
Yeah, so Chandra is the best X-ray telescope, right? It's the only one that can take really sharp X-ray pictures. It's been going for over 20 years, but it's still going great. So I particularly study quasars, which are when matter is being swallowed by a supermassive black hole. And of course, once it goes in the black hole, you can't see it. But on the way in, the gravity of the black hole squeezes it, makes it super hot. It puts out X-rays. And so I just submitted a paper where we've been studying this weird quasar that isn't behaving like the other ones. I discovered a whole cluster of galaxies sitting right next to it along the line of sight that may be affecting what we're seeing about it. And so being able to be, to find a new object in the sky, right? I mean, yeah, there are thousands of them and no one cares, right? It's like, oh, look, Starlink went up. But for me, it's still, yeah, I discovered that. And this is an enormous thing in deep space that I'm the first person to ever see it. And so that's a really nice picture you just had on the cluster of galaxies, and there's the galactic center. And so we see, basically Hubble sees the ordinary, boring part of the universe, and we see the 10% of the universe that is seriously effed up. Right? So exploding stars, black hole, all the really interesting stuff that is completely invisible to Hubble.
Right.
In a lot of cases. And so, because when matter is at 1,000,000 degrees, it shines really bright in X-rays, but it's transparent in visible light, and so you just see right through it, right? And so that's the bullet cluster there. That's there's a black hole shooting out jets at the speed of light, and this is an exploding star, freshly baked elements.
Wow.
And so, one of the things we've discovered, just to say that, the bigger, not what I work on, but the fact that carbon is common and gold is rare, right? We understand why that is now, and it's to do with nuclear reaction rates in stars.
Really?
Because every
Wow.
atom in your body was baked in a star, right? And then the star blows up, and the Earth forms from the ashes. And so, which elements are common, and we can even tell which elements were mostly made in which kind of star, and things like that. And so that's why. So it's really, we're studying our own origins. That's my office that I used to be able to go to before COVID. Everyday features of the world around us are intrinsically tied to things in deep space, because you and I are made of stardust.
Right.
In a very literal sense.
So, Jonathan, I admit I definitely want to have you back on to talk about your work, because that was seriously what I really intended to get to in the back half of this, and we ran out of time. I really do want to have you back on to talk about that, but I think there would be an absolute revolt in chat if I did not ask this final question.
Oh no.
The Kármán line, pro or con?
Well, and we're out of time, folks. So how am I supposed to display this? This is not to scale nonsense. Like, hang on, we'll start down low.
But basically, for everyone out there, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but there is this sort of idea that space begins at 100 kilometers. But Jonathan, I know you are a proponent that it's not as cut and dry as that.
Right. And really the idea, so Kármán in the 1950s came up with this idea that called the Kármán line, which was that you should define the boundary of space where basically where orbital dynamics was more important than aerodynamics, right? And that's the big picture. And over the year, the initial estimates of that were around 80 to 90 kilometers. And then over the years, people sort of felt like you couldn't define it very accurately. And so why not just pick a big round number?
Right.
And pick 100, because we're metric and not medieval. And so and so the 100-kilometer number became associated with the Kármán line, the point that people started thinking that was its definition. But historically, that's not true at all.
Okay.
And so I went back with modern atmospheric models, and modern and 50 years of data of actual satellite orbits, and tried to ask, okay, if you ask Kármán's question, what number do you come up with? And I came up with a number that's like basically 80 plus or minus 10 kilometers is where and the plus or minus 10 is depending on whether if you're asking whether aerodynamics is more important than the gravity, the aerodynamics depends on your ballistic coefficient. It depends on whether you're a sail or against cannonball, right? And so if you're cannonball, the Kármán line is lower. If you're a sail, it's higher, right? But only by like plus or minus 10 kilometers.
Huh.
Yeah.
It's actually surprisingly, and solar activity doesn't move it hardly at all, it turns out.
Okay.
And so I went into all of these things. Like, actually, it's much better defined than I had expected when I started the study. And therefore, 80 is a pretty good number, is what I'm arguing. And that 100 is, from the Kármán argument, if you want to use the Kármán argument, 100 is too high. And so 100 is only good if you just like round numbers and you don't want to bother about the physics. So that's my my claim. So I'm calling it the effective Kármán line, or whatever you want to call it, at 80 kilometers. And this started because I was making lists of astronauts, and I wanted to know Who should I
Right.
include in my list of astronauts? I was making lists of suborbital rockets. I wonder what should I include as space launches, and so I had to pick a number,
Mm-hmm.
to make my list. And so, being the obsessive mathematician that I am, I,
Come up with
uh,
a definition.
I went down the rabbit hole of what number should I really pick, and after many years of study, and taught myself atmospheric physics along the way and things like that. I came up with this answer, and that's the answer I use in the general catalog of space objects on my website when I'm listing whether things are in space or not. And I published a paper in Acta Astronautica with those results, and so it's formally refereed paper in the literature saying, yeah, this is a good choice if you're using that argument to say where should space begin.
Gotcha.
It should be 80 and not 100. And by the way, the idea that Kármán equals 100 is historically very dodgy, and so that's the short version of that argument.
I like it. I was going to ask, like,
Thank
okay,
you.
why
Yeah.
is defining this important? But defining it's important if you're saying what's in space and what's not in space, because we were talking about.
I had a need, right?
Yep,
You may
yep.
not have a need. You may not care.
So you made an equation for it and figured out where it should be, right?
Yeah.
Roughly.
Yeah.
Very cool.
But from that categorization standpoint of who's an astronaut, what made it to space? Because I think the big thing here too is like we're not talking about what's in orbit, because orbits are not stable, at 100 kilometers either.
Well,
right.
but right. Another thing I go into my paper is I looked at what's the lowest perigee that things
Right.
have multiple perigees at.
Ah.
And so, if you have like a Molniya orbit satellite, right, that has a very elliptical thing, it turns out that there's a fairly sharp cutoff that objects can survive for weeks at perigees of like 90. But once the perigee dips below 80, it's gone. It checks in and it doesn't check out.
No kidding.
Right.
For weeks or for orbits, like some number of orbits, because you could have an orbit that takes a week, or you have an orbit that takes,
Yeah.
90
Well,
minutes, whatever.
typically these are like 12-hour and less orbits that are from these 12-hour communication satellites that are coming in. And so I looked at again 90 million TLE sets, and found the ones that had low perigees. And you have to be a little careful because actually NORAD sucks at doing these low perigee elliptical orbits, and you can't always trust them, so you had to do a little filtering. But we're hand waving over that. I convinced myself that the ones I could trust, you show that you definitely see a bunch of cases where the perigee is below 100, but you don't see any cases where it's below 80 and it still is in orbit the next day.
Yeah.
And just to sort of final thing to sort of bring it back to something and connect this final question about the Kármán line back to something that we're talking about earlier, this Shenzhen 5 core stage that will be coming back in uncontrolled. This is where it gets really dodgy in trying to figure out where over Earth it's going to come, because you could be stable below 121 kilometers. You could be stable for quite some time, or the properties could just cause you to come in on that particular orbit. And this is why it's not really clear to us until we're very close to it, right?
Yeah, for the circular orbits, like 130 or 120 is as low as you get before you come in. But then they don't break up until they get to about 70 or 80.
Right.
So there's enough drag to bring them in on that orbit, and then when they get to 70 or 80, they disintegrate.
And it's tough to predict too.
But then the problem is, right, so you're going around, you're skimming horizontally around the atmosphere at orbital velocity, and a little bit of weather, right, is going to affect you. And so if you are 1 hour out in your prediction of the reentry time, you are 18,000 kilometers out. You're halfway around the world, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why we almost never get reliable predictions of where something is going to come down.
Right.
Now, where you have to know very precisely when, and you never know it to that accuracy.
And that's why we want it to be intentional, like we were intentionally controlled, like in a controlled manner, deorbiting things at a targeted location, as opposed to skim around a little bit north of 100 for a
So
while.
instead of going circular 130, you're in 400 by 100, right? Now you're in an ellipse, which hits the atmosphere at a very specific point and doesn't come out again.
I like it. If anybody asks, 80 kilometers is like the Roach Motel of orbits. Like objects check in, but they don't check out.
Exactly.
So you can use that in a paper. It is already a couple minutes over time here, y'all. We always do this every single time we run out of time. There's so many cool topics, and we could talk about any one of these for hours really quickly. The only other thing that we had on here, Chris, the space report. Do we want to do like a quick rundown on what that is?
Yeah, Jonathan, do you want to talk to us about your site and the space report and what that is? Because this is seriously, for all of you listening, like this is what we go to a lot when we need to research things. Yeah.
So there it is, and I started this in 1989, mainly as a way at the Smithsonian Observatory up at Harvard. We were the go-to place in the 1950s for when is Sputnik going overhead. But by the time I got there in the late 80s, all those people had gone, and the public affairs people were still getting queries about space that they didn't know how to answer. They just I did, and so they kept asking me, and so I started writing this in self-defense to sort of pre-write the answers so that they didn't have to come to me. And then people said, "Oh, this is there would be other people interested in this. You should put it on the internet."
Yeah.
And I mean, nah, there's maybe like 5 other people in the world who care. So I put it on what was then Usenet, and then when they invented the web, I migrated to the web, and so this has now been going since 1989, and it's like my roughly monthly screed on every satellite that goes up and what happens, and it's kind of the narrative part that's tied to the other piece of my website, which is the general catalog of space objects, which is just the list of everything since Sputnik, and also the list of all the rocket launches since the V2s in the 1940s. And so really this comes out of my desire to as a kid, to know what was going on and being frustrated that it wasn't available, and so making my own lists, and so wanting to have, and also so often, right, anyone who's been involved in a space project knows that you generate enormous amounts of documents before launch about what you're going to do, CDR, PDR, whatever, these design reviews. But then after launch, you're very lucky if anyone actually writes down what the vehicle actually did.
Right.
Especially at the end of the mission, everyone's fired, move on to other projects. They never write it, right? And so, and that's frustrating to me. I want the historian 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, to be able to find out what the spacecraft actually did,
right,
than what was planned to do, and that's hard to find. So I'm writing it down.
Well, we appreciate the fact that you're writing it down. I mean, if you're interested in what's going on in space, I recommend that you go to Jonathan's website, planet4589.org, and sign up for SatFacts. That's what this looks like to me. So it's got all sorts of stuff on the space. You said it was about a monthly thing. This is number 791.
Yeah, well, since 1989, right? It started off weekly, and then I got busy. And they're all the back issues are there, so you can check them.
Yeah.
It's been interesting. And one of the things is, it was at a time when there were like very expensive newsletters available, right? And my thing is free, and so people felt able to feed me info because they knew I wasn't, I was doing it for free. And so I've had a really good correspondence with people in the industry who read it and who feed me tidbits that I can then put in the newsletter.
Very cool. Well, I think I could probably speak for a lot of people saying thank you for all the work you've done in not only understanding all of this stuff, but documenting it for everyone else, having somebody out there that's putting all this together. We didn't even get to talk about the Russian launch cadence in the 80s and 70s. Like all the text files. I've taken your text files into Excel, pardon me, and parsed them out to try and make graphs about launch cadence and reuse of launch sites,
Yep.
turnaround times, and all this stuff. There's so much good information that exists because you've put it together, Jonathan. Like,
Well, if you
Yeah.
Wikipedia, on satellites, if you look at a random Wikipedia page on an obscure satellite, if you follow the reference trail,
Yep.
most likely it goes back to my website eventually, it turns out. So yeah, I've been putting a lot of content from. So behind me, you see the bookcase. This is one of 100 bookcases that I have here of documents from various rocket launches that I'm slowly, I'm putting the content from the page onto the internet. That's what I'm trying to do.
Wow.
And just
Wow.
trying to make it available open source for everyone. So I hope you found the one of the things in the new GCAT that people have been asking for years is that I now have tab separated value files, so that people who like Excel can import those a little more directly.
That is easier, that's for sure, instead of trying to parse out the lines. So
So look
Indeed.
out for those. Yeah.
good deal.
Well, and Jonathan, I know we have had an inordinate number of people in chat who are saying that they not only want you back, but they definitely want us to have you back to talk about your work and to talk about X-ray astronomy. So we will definitely look to do that, because I very much want to deep dive with you on all of that as
Yeah.
well.
All right, let's
Yeah.
go today.
We cannot cover
We can
all
do
these
it.
years of experience with tracking all these different things and all the things that you've involved with. No way we could shoehorn that into an hour and a half show and do it justice. We had 90 minutes, like one orbit of the ISS to get through all your
Yes.
stuff. Not enough time. Also, hey, really quickly, I gotta give you a shout out for the shirt. Does everybody know the reference on the shirt there? STS 93.
Come on, chat. You know the reference. What?
You've heard it
STS
1,000
93.
times. However many live streams we are, twice a live stream, you hear about STS 93. You just don't know it, probably.
Yeah.
That is
I was standing by the pad, in the press area, watching my entire career go up on a pillar of flame, and
And what a
hearing
launch that was.
non-standard calls and knowing enough. I was one of the few people in the team who knew enough to go,
Yep.
this is not great. So yeah, that was one of the scarier. You work on this project, right, for a decade before launch,
Mm-hmm.
20 years after launch, and there's this 8 minutes in the middle where it's all on the line. And yeah, it was. It's like, shit. Did I get my resume updated?
We all love watching rocket launches, but sometimes rocket launches can be stressful for the people that are flying stuff aboard them.
Exactly. Well, it was in July too, and I went to a July 4th fireworks display like a couple weeks before, and every firework I was like, "Oh, that looks like the Ariane 501 explosion."
Oh,
I was like matching them to disasters in my mind. So yeah, it was a very stressful time, but it worked. They did a great job. Crew of Columbia, thank you. Eileen Collins, fantastic astronaut, and so we've been getting fantastic science ever since.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I'll leave the stream live as long as y'all want to keep talking, but we're 15 minutes over right now. But there's so many questions that come through. We're not going to be able to get to them. Also, hey, like I said at the beginning, the super chats, we were not reading super chats. We do appreciate your support making these shows possible, y'all. But that, I think, is going to bring us to the end of our show. Do you get a lot of traffic on Twitter, Jonathan? Do you have people like tweeting at you or?
Oh, totally, all the time. Yeah. So
All the
Planet
time.
4589 on Twitter. You can reach me there, and I do my best to answer people's questions as time allows.
Yep. And I'm actually going to put the link to your Twitter into chat. 4589. There we go. Like that. It's not platelet 4589. It's planet. Sorry, I can't type.
no,
There
that's a
we go.
different branch of
That's
science.
a different,
Mouse.
different
So
science
that is
there.
minor planet 4589, which is named after me. So that was kind of fun.
Wait, I just put that in the wrong. That's not even where we're supposed to go. Here, it's supposed to go here.
That's correct, chat. Jonathan has a minor planet named after him. You heard that correctly.
A lot of people in chat saying, bring Jonathan back again. Jonathan, you
Yes.
have been an absolutely fantastic guest on our show. I don't even feel like you're a guest. I just give you the reins. Tell me on what to click on. Just listening to you and getting to spend an hour and a half here with you was an absolutely fantastic experience. Thank you so much for joining us on NASA
Well, thank
Spaceflight
you.
Live.
I've been saying to you before we started, I mean, I have been a fan of the NASA Spaceflight website since it started. It's really, it's really changed how we interact with the, the geekdom of space, and so keep up the great work.
Excellent.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. But that is going to bring us to the end of the show here, y'all. Thank everyone for tuning in today. I've just been rapidly listening. I think sometimes, Chris, your camera was messing up. I wasn't even paying attention to that. I could have fixed it, but I was listening to Jonathan. I wasn't looking at your camera.
I don't think
I
it was
think I
messed up.
noticed it
think
once, but I
actually,
think it
like,
happened
I don't
more
know if
than
you
once.
guys- yeah, he did it again.
Yeah.
Did you guys see the season of Discovery where
Yeah.
the AI has taken over
Oh, yes.
the AI? Yeah. So I think that the control has taken you over, and you're
Part of the
pixelated.
aesthetic, like.
Oh dear, that must mean I'm integral for the future. I fear for our future if I'm integral to it, but
Chris's appearance today was just a deep fake. It was all CGI for Chris. And every
yes.
now and then it glitched. Like. But folks, our guest today, Jonathan McDowell, Planet 4589 on Twitter, purveyor of all things in space, also with the Chandra X-ray telescope program. Jonathan, one more time, thank you so much for spending time with us this week, and we appreciate the time.
Okay, take care, guys.
All right. Also, Chris Gebhardt, your assistant. Chris Gebhardt is teleporting away.
Oh, I'm doing it again. Yes.
They're trying to beam him up, but they can't get a lock.
Control doesn't like it. Control doesn't like it.
Hit the,
Sphere data, download it. Come on.
The button that I click is actually called Rainbow Puke Fix. In the interface, it is labeled Rainbow Puke Fix. And I click the button and it refreshes your feed. We need to run an Ethernet 9 in your house is what we need to do. But for now, folks, Chris Gebhardt.
We do. We can talk about that.
This way here, Chris Gebhardt, Assistant Managing Editor for NASASpaceflight. Chris, thank you so much for the time today. Excellent.
It was my pleasure, and it was a wonderful conversation, Jonathan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. And lastly here, folks, I'm John Galloway with NASA Spaceflight, not clicking on the rainbow puke button as much as I should have, but that was a fantastic conversation that we had today. Jonathan, we look forward to talking to you again in the future. Thank you so much for joining us. But that is going to be the end of NASA Spaceflight Live. As we do really quickly, thank you to all of the members that make these shows possible. We do this in the NASA Spaceflight Live weekend shows. The font is getting smaller and smaller and smaller on this page. But we want to say thank you so much for your recurring support on a monthly basis that allows us to do these things. Also, hey, special for today, all the super chats that we didn't read, we see you, like they're right there in the queue. We appreciate everything y'all do that allows us to keep doing these shows. Even just showing up. We turn on the stream, y'all show up, you have great questions, great participation. So thank y'all so much for making this possible. But again, that is going to bring us to the end of today's NASA Spaceflight Live, and the crew here will be signing off. Look for us on Monday. Potential Starlink flights. Starlink flights. I have Starlink on the Starship flights on Monday. I was actually working on a meme specifically for Jonathan here, and did not quite get a chance to show how many Starlinks this bad boy gets fit.
Really hard for me, because half of me is like, woo, cool space tech, and the other half of it is like, oh, we're hosed as astronomers, and so it's very disorienting.
You can see it's still in the editor. I didn't get a chance to finish it, but we will be looking for what Starship is doing on Monday. We know that there's a potential flight with restrictions and stuff like that, so make sure that you're here on the channel, turn on the notifications and stuff, look for that coverage on Monday just in case something happens down at Boca Chica. For now, we'll be signing off, and we will see you nerds later. Thank you so much for joining us.
Chamber pressure looks good. Following up. Roger, roll, planet.
Concur. We don't need any more of these.